And in a sense, what I began to think about was an approach to assessment which was much more performance-based, emanating from the engagements of students in classrooms, oftentimes which are project-oriented, and it's across time, and it's involving a form of reflection and student self-assessment. And so as I thought about it in terms of assessing assessment, wow, what I'm talking about is assessment that really might help students develop criteria for assessing themselves and for making plans as to what they might do next. At the same time as these portfolios or these performance assessments could inform teachers' teaching because they're so close to the ground of what's going on in the classroom. And not only that, would probably also be helpful in terms of parents. Because as parents engage with their children in their classrooms and then they get to sort of see this work, a teacher can sort of walk them through over time so that they can actually also evidence the improvement in conjunction with having their children talk about what is they're trying to do and what they might do next. And so it was an orientation to assessment which changed in a sense of prepositions. It wasn't assessment which you do to people, it was assessment that you do with people over time, not at a time. And it was quite dramatic in terms of thinking. But as I pursued this idea, I was able to persuade a couple of teachers to explore this with me in high schools and elementary schools. And it was quite stunning when we started out. We first started out by asking ourselves the question, well, maybe we should be assessing teachers' and students' views of themselves, which we began to do. We quickly discovered that students' views of themselves tended to be fairly restricted and fairly narrow, and they really didn't have much in the way of criteria by which they judged themselves. We asked ourselves, whoa, all these wonderful times over their school careers that they could have done this. We also discovered when we asked kids to begin to pull together their work across time, that they really got an opportunity to do that. In reading classrooms, most things were always sort of moving forward with little time taken to pause and reflect and look back. Students commented that this was the first time in their educational experience that they remember actually being encouraged to look back beyond a day or two. What was also remarkable was when students did share their work in this way, that over time they started to develop criteria and a better and more positive sense of themselves. Particularly given the fact that we were sort of trying to emphasize, well, what are you seeing in terms of growth? And so we started to see in schools in this period, as a result of the cognition and metacognition stuff, but also as a result of the sort of socio-political stuff, an emphasis upon classroom-based assessment, which was learner-centered. We were sort of moving in a sort of into the realm of constructivism, very similar to what some of the qualitative researchers were arguing for, was a form, particularly in terms of their approaches to research, of when you're studying people, doing it in a fashion where you're engaged in responsive evaluation. As we were dealing with performance assessment and portfolios, we were certainly approaching it in a dialogue with the students as they looked at their work over time And what we were encouraging them to do was to be, very much self-determined inquirers of their own progress. What was interesting was the shifts we saw in students' developmental criteria, but what was also interesting was a study done by Richard Shavelson and his colleagues. I think he was at Santa Barbara at this point in time, where he actually looked to see if, in fact, a performance assessment versus traditional forms of assessment were more sensitive to differences of instruction. And so he actually compared in science classrooms, I think it was just in science classrooms, how students performed in performance-based assessment, things like portfolios and other things that are consistent with what I've talked about here, versus things like short answer questions and multiple choice tests. What he found was the performance assessment was very sensitive to differences in instruction, again, a textbook-based approach versus a project one in science. But the other ones, the short answer questions and multiple choice, didn't show the differences. Again, sort of making an argument for moving towards this approach to assessment. In my own teaching, I found this involved major shifts in my own thinking about approaching students, not treating them as if they're a blank slate, but actually coming to classrooms with material and let's just sort of see where we go, where we might go next. That a goal of education, a goal of assessment is a teaching and learning goal of helping students assess themselves. And I would argue that maybe that should be a key priority of any assessment program in schools. Many people still hang on to that, but right behind these developments in school were two other developments. One that sort of played right into this and supported it, another one which didn't. The one that played right into it was the advent of sort of digitally based education or web-based projects and other things, projects that were coming out of the digital turn that was occurring. And so as students were basically pulling together different projects and that, you can imagine how well these sort of fit into the whole folders and network of ideas that fit with the digital developments. So on the positive side, you could sort of see that contributing to it. On the negative side, however, what we also saw beginning to occur globally was a shift in the politics of education to an age of accountability and reform. And so what I'd like to do next is sort of talk about the impact of the accountability and reform developments that occurred in the mid-90s into the 2000s and still to some extent persist today.